Hello and welcome everybody to our January edition of OT Office Hours. I'm Sam Becker. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. And today is another installment of our OT Office Hours, which is where our team brings to you a topic that's specific to OT, give you a little bit of education around it, and then open the floor up for you to ask us any questions that you might have about it. The session is intended to be interactive. So for the first, portion of this, we'll go through some slides, but if you have questions, please submit them to me through the chat or Q&A functions, and I will answer those towards the end or if there's a break in the presentation. So for those that don't know, Insane Cyber is a cybersecurity organization that is designed with OT in mind. We offer innovative products and services that help protect our critical infrastructure. So our flagship Valkyrie product helps to automate cybersecurity through host and network data monitoring, including asset ID and expediting incident response through automated data review. We also offer managed and professional services. So today we are going to be diving into solving the asset ID challenge. And we are joined by our CEO and founder, Dan Gunner, our Director of Sales, Brad Fusilier, and our Director of Engineering, John Rubin. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them to get started.
Thanks, Sam. I'll go ahead and kick off. So as Sam said, my name's Dan Gunner. I'm the CEO and founder. Started the company back in 2020. Before Insane Cyber, was with another cybersecurity vendor, early employee there, grew up both the professional services and the R&D side. Prior to that was with the Air Force, experience with control systems, actually dealt with it all through my career. So, excited y'all are here. Thanks for joining. And with that, I'll turn over to John for an intro.
Hi, I'm John Rubin. I'm the Director of Engineering at Insane Cyber. I got my start around mid-2000s in the open source world in video transcoding and filtering, and moved on from there to market research, where I worked in endpoint agents and ended up around 8 years ago in cybersecurity in the network monitoring space. And I've been with Insane since last September. Brad?
Thanks, John. My name is Brad Fusilier, Director of Sales at Insane Cyber. Been here for the past 6 months. Prior to my time at Insane Cyber, I worked for an asset discovery solution provider as well as an OT GRC company. Been in the critical infrastructure for the past 12 years in various roles, mainly in chemical sector as well as obviously OT security and asset discovery.
So starting out, what is asset ID, right? A lot of people have different definitions. What happens too is you often get vendors dropping in their own definitions that point to their products. And so a definition we wanted to kind of go with to kick off, right, is really where we see asset ID is that process of discovering, categorizing, documenting, assets within IT and OT. This is a challenge, right? If you're in a regulated space, there's potential, cost to not getting this right. There's safety cost to this, right? Understanding what assets are, controlling things that are moving benzene around, moving around acid, moving around other things, right? Also very much matters from the security ops side of, if you don't know what you have, then, or, your IR plan might not be ready for dealing with the realities of that, right? If you don't know you have Schneider Electric, do you know, how to respond to, do you know how to thread on out there, right? So, asset ID is important to a lot of parts of organizations. Groups we talk to come to us both for the compliance side. Hey, keep me in good check with NERC CIP. They also come from that security side of, hey, we need to know what's out there to kind of make sure it's adequately secured. To that point too, it's understanding your architecture, where the bits and bytes are actually flowing to make sure, the safeguards you think you have in place actually control things. And good point on that, right, is Shodan's great for asset ID. And a lot of asset owners get kind of poked at Shodan when they don't realize that, hey, maybe this internet connected PLC with Modbus straight facing out to the wild, it's better to know, right, that you have that before others do. So finally, yeah, protecting critical infrastructure and sensitive data is super key, right, to that Modbus PLC point. if you don't have authentication set on that PLC, someone can pull your project file, right? Someone can pull other stuff. There's something that controls. So Asset ID hopefully isn't just compliance for you. Hopefully it's also that security and safety side because it's really key. Brad, John, anything else? Y'all want to chime in there, or did I hit it pretty well?
Yeah, I thought you captured it pretty well. One note that I'll add on why it matters is lifecycle management. In the space, we often don't talk enough about obsolescence planning and rolling off devices that can't be updated or upgraded by the vendor. There is kind of this changing of the guard of people who know a lot about these OT devices into either the newer resources who may have less experience with the devices. There's a huge importance of like how do you maintain security in an environment where there's this huge knowledge transfer and then also in a space where devices are starting to become obsolete. So Asset ID is important for that reason, in my opinion, and I often not talked about enough.
Say that there are two more questions I think we're going to get into more a little bit further, which just breaks down the initial one there, which is what is an asset and what is an ID?
Yeah, we'll hit that too. And there's fun when you get into, and I wasn't going to bring it up on this slide till we hit that, but it gets fun when you get into PLCs and it being modular and hey, the Ethernet card on that backplane, it actually moves around, right? Before we hit that, we'll move into types of assets. So we generally see four different types of assets. There's the actual physical side, right? Servers, workstations, the actual PLCs themselves, right? There's the data asset, the actual bits and bytes flowing through that you have to secure, right? Your project files, other key data in there. That is still an asset, right? As it flows through your network, like it's still important to track that. Because if you have project files just flowing, if you have other things flowing, technically it is a data asset itself. That operational data is key. You look at some of the black energy intrusions, some of the others that go through hitting Excel spreadsheets that the engineers use for Asset ID and for other things, right? 100% technically that is a data asset, and attackers do actually use those. They've used those for a long time and a lot of different plan environments, a lot of scissor reports and other open reports on that. Digital assets, right? What's the actual service that's running the architecture? So if you're in oil and gas on Experion, right, you're running a lot of S&B. There's a lot of Microsoft data services there. If you're on Ovation, right, the database server there is more Oracle, right? If you're on some of the ADMS networks we've seen, understanding, hey, I have the TIBCO messaging queue under this. I have, RabbitMQ. I have MQTT. Understanding those digital assets, what's rolling through those is key, right? Because at one front, it's easy to say, hey, I just have this PLC. On another front, it's funny when we hit ADMS networks and we're like, well, do you actually understand how TIBCO, how MQTT, how all of these applications within your EMS or ADMS network actually work? Those are still kind of assets because like you could poke at them and be like, hey, what happens if this application on your EMS or ADMS network goes out? Oh, there's digital assets under the hood. So again, definitions, a lot of vendors like just saying like, hey, that hardware PLC, I can put it in an Excel spreadsheet and call it a day, but it gets challenging, right? Then human assets, right? Tracking users, tracking administrators, tracking those. Again, there's a whole human asset kind of layer there. So this is probably a little more comprehensive than some definitions others use. At the same time, it's really key to operations. Brad, John, I'll let y'all hop in again.
Yeah, with respect to the types of assets, one thing to be noted is every single one of these asset classifications are increasing in number and scale. If you think about physical assets, obviously IoT devices are increasing in the OT space. And in general, like networks are getting larger on the OT space to support different aspects of operations. On the data side, we are all trying to move into the digital twin space. So we're collecting all of this data to support operations remotely. So we're creating more data from every single end of the OT network and from the different devices within that network. On the digital side, we all know there's new applications out to support security, to support AI, to support analysis of data, right? So all of these applications create a new layer for cybersecurity. And then also on the human side, like we may have decreased the number of users or people who own applications within companies, but we've increased the number of third-party vendors who have access to support those environments remotely. So every single one of these categories are increasing by sheer number, which widens the landscape for threats and vulnerabilities.
Not only are the numbers changing, not only is the volume increasing, but the interconnections between them are too, because these aren't separate things that can be tracked totally separately. An application as a digital asset is going to live on different servers. It's going to connect to different databases, which are another kind of digital asset. They're going to run over network routers and switches. And when you're trying to understand the security stance of a particular service that you're running, you have to consider all of these different things. If you're looking at a user, for example, that user may own services that are running somewhere. They may also be logged into a machine while that machine is doing something else. And you may end up with one user associated with multiple different devices or one device associated with multiple different users. And that happens across all of these different types of assets. It's a layered, interconnected world.
And last note I'll say before we hop to the next slide, where we've seen some spicier, interesting stuff out in industrial networks with this has been over some of the like third-party maintenance networks. We've seen, third-party OEMs actually bridge Windows domains into environments. We've seen, kind of deals. And so why this breakdown is important and why it's important to just kind of split out from physical is that in some cases, we've actually seen OEMs put manage boxes in a planned environment off of their domain that's actually remotely out. And so to that point of asset ID, if your asset ID is not deep, you're going to find out about that either because someone breaches it or, hopefully in an assessment, right? So asset lifestyle. So the way we view it here again is for OT networks, like industrial networks, what's key here is you have that procurement side. If it's greenfield, right, you do come into kind of a nice environment, so you can do some of the fab and other testing leading in. As you're deploying those out, those integrate in. Then it becomes in maintenance and decommissioning. Well, obviously these investments happen over a long amount of time. There's some asset ID you can actually do in that procurement phase as you're actually building out in vendor OEM side before you push over, as it pushes over in maintenance, something for asset ID I always like seeing folks do, and I've seen folks test products on this is maintenance wise, what if I take that Ethernet card in my PLC backplane and move it from slot 3 to slot 6, right? Can I see my asset management tool? Is it going down to the level of, hey, this modular part of this, PLC of this backplane actually moved from site to site? Because believe it or not, in some of the industrial traffic, if the asset ID solution's looking for it, you actually can update some of that catalog. And so to points, as you're going through maintenance, whether this be software or hardware maintenance, things do change, right? This changes with the realities of the operational environment. Same with decommissioning, things can change there. Where I've also seen a lot in asset lifestyle, if you're dealing with brownfield site where you're actually accepting someone else's asset ID also becomes important for even knowing what you've had. I've done brownfield sites to where we come in before they're actually buying the site to be like, hey, like, tell us where the skeletons are, tell us where the risk is. For some, it's also tell us, hey, what assets are here that might not be in the due diligence paperwork or the engineering documents there, right? So from an asset cycle perspective, one of the big challenges is with OT environments, it's never always cut and dry, just because of the scope. And as the plan and process gets bigger, it only gets more complicated. Brad, over to you.
Yeah, and agree with all points. I think most people spend most of their time thinking about the maintenance piece and how do you maintain these assets and ensure you're getting the right type of asset ID information, like software level, firmware version, right? To understand what the vulnerabilities are. But I thought the point that you made about acquiring new assets, we see so many acquisitions of companies these days with the consolidation on the oil and gas side or even on the energy side, there's some skeletons out there, and without proper asset ID in place, you may be assuming risks that you don't know about, right? So um, there are a lot of ways that asset ID can enrich some of the processes through an acquisition and through kind of expanding, the business beyond the acquisition cycle.
If you look at a lot of asset inventories, they'll end up just being spreadsheets, right? They'll have a column that has, first seen, last seen. The problem there is that, as this discussion shows, these assets live, they have lives. At some point, they sunset and they get replaced. They change while they're alive in different ways. And you really need to make sure that your asset solution is tracking those changes, first detecting them and then tracking them and understanding the change in what information is being shared as part of what you're learning about the environment, instead of just seeing it as, well, we see this identifier, we see this value, this thing is always that because we saw it, when it's not. It's always in flux.
And last note here, where I think we're sitting on a interesting kind of inflection point for asset ID, to that point of just beyond like, just give me the IP and the make, model, and version of this is, we talked about kind of those data assets. We talked about the software asset changes. SBOM, there's more and more SBOM companies showing up every day. As soon as you get a firmware update to a PLC and push it, your whole CV architecture, like, what's baked into that firmware update can entirely change some of the asset picture, depending on the scope of what you're interested going down to. So, as you think of asset ID, as the market kind of changes, the other thing to kind of look at is, hey, how does a firmware update even change the state of this asset, right? I don't know if we'll hit this in a minute. It's interesting as you go through it, because even some asset ID products, right, depending on the protocol you're pulling, you can ask the asset ID of a device using its OT protocol. Sometimes it'll give you operational state. Sometimes it'll give you other data. Sometimes, if you're actively polling, if you're using certain different techniques, you can actually pull like, okay, hey, can I get a little lower to see, has something actually changed on this device that's, below just that IP and, firmware version level, right? So these are complicated things, like, right, we're talking computers and computers and computers, and it's only getting more fun. Yeah, methods for asset ID. Thanks for that. We view really 4 ways of getting to asset ID. Active scanning, asking the PLC, hey, what are you? There's certainly products out doing this. Ways we see them doing this, I mean, they're doing it everything from, let me generate the one Modbus packet to ask you what you are, to, hey, it turns out UMass, it turns out for Schneider Electric, SDI for G. Others do have some level of asset ID, right? Safety of these is, of course, down to vendor. Our way, when we're doing it, uses often the built-in specific protocol way because we're more comfortable with that, right? There's other ways group scan. I mean, looking over at I think Sharon Brisnow from Clarity did a really good talk at I don't know if it was DEF CON or before, on Sharon's talk was like talking through detecting like asset ID off of the network stack based on how certain PLCs responded to given packets. And so, that's also kind of an active scanning of, I'm using kind of a fingerprint of, unique ways that this specific software stack on this specific PLC responds. And he actually found some pretty cool ways of fingerprinting actively just off of TCP connections. Like, it's kind of cool. It's similar to, you go to some IT tools that use things like traceroute or time to live and other things that have set values. Turns out there's some OT specific ways of doing active scanning. So active scanning does use a packet to send it out. Can be direct, believe it or not, with a 61850. You actually can send direct, but you actually can send a packet to broadcast and have PLCs on the broadcast domain tell you what you are. So different techniques for active scanning. Passive observation, same deal. If you're sitting on the wire, this is just watching for the actual asset ID coming through. Oftentimes, the way we approach is, if we're doing active, we'll also pick up the passive, because whether we generate that active scan or whether others do, you can still passively see it, right? So pulling it off of the wire, pulling it out that way, that's key. Configuration files. So what's interesting when you look at the market is a lot of the network focused products seem to either be doing passive and or maybe some of them have active. Then there are separate products, right, in the space that are using configuration files. And I think Brad will probably share some insights on some of that, but configuration file is another solid way of doing it. Manual walk down, last one, then I'll turn over and Brad and John to add more. We see this still a lot on plants being like, hey, I have my Excel spreadsheet. I just want to either walk the plant myself or hire a firm to do the walk down. Big challenge here is that you're doing it manually. The minute you leave the site, the accuracy and scale of this becomes untenable to keep up, to where sometimes you actually need the assistance. So, Brad, I'll kick over to you.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, great descriptions of each type, right? There are limitations to all. I will say, from my experience with configuration files, it is pretty thorough in terms of the information you get on the assets. But just in how it's deployed, it's really hard to scale. The way it typically works is you look at configuration backup files from a central part on the network for OT devices. In most cases, that's going to be the control system. And then use some type of group policy to pull in the engineering workstations associated or within the network of the control system. Very, rich information, but how do you do that if you have, one, environments that don't have a centralized control system, or two, where you have a large scale chemical plant with more, like, hundreds of PLCs and 15 to 20 control systems. So it's just hard to scale. The manual walk down, I'll speak to just my experience working with other OEMs on this, and asset owners within the space and their experience working with OEMs. The data is good up until the time the service provider walks off the site, right? Assets change. We just talked about how the landscape is super wide, and there's so many different variations or classes of assets. So it's really hard to say you're going to do a manual asset ID or asset inventory data collection and feel really comfortable with the data. You take out the human element of like fat fingering things. We're talking about just simply not being able to collect the amount of data that's out there that's needed to have a really foundational asset inventory.
It's really something that requires a hybrid approach. You have to take from all of these different techniques what you can and combine it together, because there's value in even the manual walkdown. Lots of organizations, like you're saying, they'll have a spreadsheet of their asset inventory. It's not up to date, it's not current, it's not complete, but it's what they have. And if they can provide that, that gives you something that you can enrich and supplement and correct with other sources of information, so that as you combine all these different things together, you end up with the best picture you can get of what's going on inside of an environment.
We'll talk through some challenges. So one, as we said, is that ambiguous definition of an asset. The point everyone either defines it to, their area of interest. Is this an asset for the point of NERC CIP compliance? Is this an asset for the point of the asset management solution I'm selling and the focus that it goes down to? Or is this an asset from kind of that comprehensive understanding, top and bottom, knowing that, right, you can dig kind of deep into that definition of asset. Another one there, vendor products making assumptions, not necessarily true. To call out a big one there, like you'll see some asset management products that are entirely based on, hey, an asset is an IP address, and they struggle to deal with either, hey, this asset's multi-homed, or it turns out, IPs can move around, or to that modular, PLC moving around, right? Things aren't always at the same IP addresses. IP MAC situations change. There are a lot of industrial protocols too, or quite a few that don't require an IP packet either. And so, solutions that are built around, hey, an asset will always have an IP address. They're actually out there, and that's not necessarily true. Outdated record keeping, another big one. Difficult to reach assets. This is another one to where like you get into the passive space and you ask someone for their asset ID list, and just wherever whatever solution is out on the network, it doesn't see, right? Hey, our substation rings, we're only seeing east to west, right? Or hey, we're only seeing this part of the plant. You not only is the record keeping necessarily outdated, but if you're not actually in the right location, there can be issues if you're only passive, right? If you're active, it's the same deal. Hey, I'm using let me send this packet to a broadcast domain and have the PLCs respond. Well, if you can't reach the broadcast domain, right? If you don't have routing actually to, the PLC or whatever you're asking that question from, there can be challenges. Get out into renewable sites, right? Get out into battery sites, get out into, field sites that are farther out. Those often can be harder to reach. These networks are always changing. Challenge also from the walk down reliance on professional services, keeping that up to date. The rigidity and asset ID tools, some of this gets to that, hey, are we only at Purdue boundaries? Are we only at, kind of high risk parts? Right, you go into oil and gas networks, a lot of them are redundant networks. Are we only looking at, kind of one side of that redundant network, not understanding the other side, right? Inconsistent naming and, proprietary protocol is always a challenge there. That's the reason commercial tools do win over tools like Malcolm. Malcolm's a great tool. Malcolm doesn't have a ton of proprietary protocols like some of the commercial tools have, right? So, not having that proprietary information on protocols, or kind of the fact of, hey, if someone were to put this open OEM protocol out, would the legal department of that open OEM of that protocol appreciate you publishing out basically, proprietary information, aka their proprietary protocol? So lots of challenges there. Brad, I'll kick to you for a minute.
Yeah, one additional challenge that I'll highlight is around aggregation. So now asset owners or risk managers who work for asset owners are now being asked to quantify the risk of certain events, right? When we think about like the Colonial Pipeline situation, or any situation where an OT environment has been hit, the thought is, well, how big is the impact of being hit? When with respect to asset ID, we think about, what are the assets that we have in our environment? Where else are those assets? Where do they live, right? If I'm at a chemical plant in the US and I have a chemical plant in Mexico, how many of these assets do I have at both locations, not just one? And then you also think about remote locations. In a lot of ways, the industry has moved to a situation where, either due to function or commercial reasons, there's not many solutions that can support remote environments that like a terminal for a pipeline, right? A small remote location like that, and kind of the huge operations where you've got multiple networks. So um, data aggregation from an asset ID perspective in order to enable vulnerability management, patch management, risk quantification, and risk closure in general is something that I see as a huge challenge with the products that are currently on the market, and just the overall kind of technical the technical gap that we have on the market in the OT space.
Yeah, I just want to stress again here the fuzziness of all of this. Several different of the bullet points here are related to that. The ambiguous definition of an asset and also of an identity. The assumptions that vendor products can make, the inconsistency in naming, and the fact that a single asset can exist and respond on multiple different protocols. So one thing manufactured by one company, one physical tangible thing on a network may show up as three different assets from different perspectives. One from maybe local link discovery, another from a vendor proprietary protocol, another from something else that's operating in between those protocols. And they all may identify themselves in different ways. One may only use a MAC address, one may use MAC and IP, one may have a slot ID or something else in there as well. And one may have a field called system name and it's foo with a lowercase f, and another may have the device name and it's foo with a capital F. Are those the same things or are they different? Well, they're probably the same thing, but you have to normalize it. And the same thing can happen as well with really critical fields like the version number of a particular device. You may see in one protocol it reports as 1.4, in another protocol it reports as 1.43. Does the first one just truncate? Are they separate things reporting different levels of the tech stack? But all of those are connected to the same device and they all have to be considered together.
And another fun one we'll deal with on that too, or we deal with and we see some on that too, is right, serial to Ethernet converters, right? So PLCs on a serial bus behind a Ethernet converter. Some asset ID solutions are good at seeing, hey, I see, multiple Modbus station IDs going to this, serial to Ethernet converter, and I know there are PLCs behind this running serial. That we don't see on the Ethernet network, but we see on that other side, right? Those are still assets. They're not Ethernet assets, but they are on that other side there. And so to John's point, what's challenging is even on the same PLC based on, the protocol you use to ask questions, you sometimes do get version or other differences. Some of the other fun architectural side of it is, how good is the data that actually gets sent through? Because a lot of the asset ID fields, at least in the common protocol, right? It might be in an IEC spec or in a spec like, hey, you have to have these fields. And these fields are nice to have, but there's not always a whole lot of nice normalization. And when you get to the kind of the data science side of it, is oftentimes there are conflicts between fields that you get back. So from that garbage in, garbage out, having an OT tool that kind of can deal with conflicting information and knows like, hey, let's trust the 61850 asset ID over the Modbus if I get both right, or hey, let me bring it this way. Those are really big, honest challenges in both writing asset ID software and how it works on the bits by level between PLCs and other devices. ID best practices. So, definitely you want to maintain that comprehensive asset inventory. This is becoming more and more important, especially in the space we're in. Using automated tools is key because, again, you can do walkdowns. It's going to be out of date. That could get you in trouble. It could create challenges when you go out there. We deal with folks that are all at the sophistication level of super sophisticated, knowing entirely what they have, all the way down to, hey, we have no clue what's in this plant environment. And so using automated tools can kind of help with that. classifying assets by criticality and risk level, this is key. You want criticality both to your operations, as well as criticality to, supply chain and other factors, right? Hey, this asset would, stop our ability for this given process to run, right? Or hey, we don't have a lot of hot spares of this asset, so if we lose it, we could end up in an extended maintenance situation, right? Um, and with risk level, right, knowing what it supports there, regularly reviewing and updating those inventories, both assets you can reach as well as assets out in the field. Maybe you're really good at understanding your assets in generation, but you're not so good on transmission or distribution, right? Creating the ability actually to keep your asset inventory comprehensive and deal with either the geographical or kind of the network security boundaries of that is key. So establishing those key clear ownership and responsibilities for assets is key. Hopefully you have a good incident response and threat hunting plan. Hopefully you have solid deals in place between operational teams and IT as it's relevant and others to deal with that. But if asset ID is honestly a part of that list, because oftentimes the asset you need to reach might be the responsibility of someone else. And if it's in that kind of vendor maintenance network type deal, I've had cases where we've actually worked with OEMs or with other vendors on being like, hey, to the joined asset deal, we kind of need to know what's going on because we saw traffic we have to deal with across there. And then integrating asset ID into the broader security processes, right? On this, it's making sure your IR plan's there, making sure, you have the relationships in place when you need them, right? Making sure you're holding folks accountable when they should be. Asset ID is a key part because again, it's your situational awareness for what's out in the environment. Brad, over to you.
Yeah, so the industry has spent, millions of dollars, probably billions at this point, on asset ID solutions. And it's kind of like you go through the steps to secure your OT environment. The typical first step is network segmentation, is kind of what I've seen. The next step is asset inventory. What I think has been lost is, what does asset inventory enable for you? So if you have an asset inventory solution in place, do you expect it to enable vulnerability management? Do you expect it to support your incident response plan? Do you expect it to support obsolescence planning, right? Like understanding what the connection and what the results you expect from asset ID and kind of passive network monitoring or active network monitoring, right, is really critical because it can get lost in the deployment of asset ID solutions. It takes a long time. The data can be great by the end of it, but you've got to remember, like, what is the reason why we wanted to deploy the solution, so you can build a better security program around this data that you collect.
There's something that's kind of implicit in this slide that I just want to call out, which is the integral role of the asset owner in this. Yes, you want your asset inventory to be comprehensive. To do that, you need to use automated tools that can monitor continuously. But that step of classifying assets by criticality and risk level and reviewing and updating the inventories, that's where you bring the human back into the loop. And it's where you tune the system to really work for your environment. And if you simply have a turnkey asset solution that you don't take the time to do that with, to groom and cultivate the way you need it to be, it's never going to give you what you need.
I'll only slide on how we kind of fit into the asset ID problem. So what we do through Valkyrie, we can do both batch and streaming, host and network data analysis. What's interesting with that is we'll go out to battery sites. We'll go out to a lot of other sites that don't honestly have a whole lot of monitoring out there, nor do they have a lot of awareness out there, right? And we bring back terabytes of PCAP often and run it through. We're using asset ID on this to be like, hey, hey, at this battery site, we're seeing Windows Server 2003. We're seeing all of these assets out here. what's interesting too, so our ability to handle both, batch and streaming network data is key. What's cool with that is if there are asset solutions, even if the engineering workstation is open, connected to a PLC or certain other asset management tools are out there, our ability to actually parse asset ID out of packets is something we're growing as we're going through. Where it gets interesting too from a differentiation is on the host side. You give us the Windows registry. If we have the uninstall keys, technically we actually can get down to some of the application layer, right? We do see command lines out of Windows event logs that we can get to, potentially identifying that certain things are there. So, from that perspective, where we're able to sit as both handling host and network data on an interesting perspective, but then also putting it out with Valkyrie, we can put it on a 3-pound flyweight kit to push it out to remote sites, to isolated sites there. So Brad, John, where else did I miss in there? And then we'll open up for questions.
I'll just add one point. I think there are a lot of solutions that do collection in different ways. I think Dan, you summarized the way we collect very well. The part that I'll add is on the analysis piece. We do have some configurable options for different types of analysis of network host or config data. So we're not necessarily locked to one way of reading and resulting information from the data that we collect.
Yeah, not being locked into one way is a great way to put it. To me, the big thing about our approach is that we embrace the ambiguity. We don't try to stamp it with a particular viewpoint. We take in all of these different data points that we observe in all of these different ways, and we correlate them together.
And the last thing I'll say is we're plugin based, and so we had an asset owner a few weeks back, I think, that was generating asset ID using a specific tool, and we were actually able to kind of take advantage of that data to where they actually could import their asset inventory data from another tool in and have that in. So flexibility on us, we can deal kind of with disparate data, whether it be from the host and network, in pretty quick time. We turned that around actually in a matter of days of adding the ability to add that given asset inventory in. So with that, Sam, I'll turn over to you to see if we have any good questions.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That was a lot of really good information. So, a couple of things to dive into a little bit more. We talked a lot about the importance of, keeping an asset inventory, and I think that that is a daunting task for a lot of people, right? And so, I'm curious to get some thoughts from you. Maybe John, I'll pose this question to you, but what are your thoughts on putting together an asset inventory in a way that it can be a living, breathing document? I know that we talked about Excel spreadsheets and how that's kind of like a hard thing to do because that's not really living, breathing. So I'm curious if you have any tips for how people can improve that.
Well, I think one of the challenges there is that, in the security industry, we rely heavily on the ELK stack. And in Elasticsearch, you're kind of encouraged, if not really forced, to consider data to be a single record. It's not very performant when it comes to doing aggregations, like Brad was talking about, across lots of different pieces of data. And so that means that a lot of the ways that people think about asset ID right now do boil down to something that's equivalent to a spreadsheet. You have a single row, you have some columns with a specific value for that column, and that's it for that asset. I think the key thing is to look for a solution that gives you the flexibility to consider lots of different samples or observations as all being related to the same asset in the end, and to be able to slice and dice that in different ways instead of it being set in stone, so that you can consider it from different perspectives. What if I only look in terms of IP address? What if I look in terms of IP and MAC, or add on another identifier as well, in order to see what is my confidence there for what this asset is?
Okay, great. Thank you. So another question I think that hasn't been posed, but it's something that I am curious about. So maybe some of our attendees here have the same question. But if you're looking at getting started with a tool, or like you're looking at implementing a product that's going to help you do Asset ID, where do you start with that? Where do you what does that look like? Is that a heavy, like how heavy of a lift of that is that for an asset owner? Brad, I'll pose that to you.
Yeah, I would say the first thing you want to do is identify what you expect Asset ID to enable you to do. Because the different solutions and the different types of Asset ID collection will determine the information that you get out of Asset ID, and depending on what you want to do with it, should lead you to one solution versus the other. The other thing that I would say is make sure that you ask those providers for POCs, just because you know, telling the provider that you have certain assets, they're going to return a protocol list, and that protocol list is ambiguous. I mean, it defines kind of what they support, but it doesn't define necessarily it doesn't give you an expanded view of kind of what you get out of those protocols. So yeah, I'm basically saying do your research and make sure you have clear goals in mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and to kind of go off that too, like another thing to understand, you have to understand your operational environment, right? Is this a key operational environment where passive network monitoring has like a high view of my network? Because like on one hand, like right, passive network monitoring tool sets have done very well the past few years as long as the data actually goes through where those passive tools are. Well, like we go in and we ask asset owners, we're like, okay, how much of the key traffic with actual asset ID data are going through those key points, right? And how your industrial environment is architected. Um, you can spend a lot of money and not have Asset ID actually come through the point that it's going to go through, right? And you're just spending money basically on a checkbox on that point, right? To where you need kind of a flexible solution beyond that. Another is, I would say, look at how the vendor, like kind of ask good questions on the vendor on how they're doing it, right? Or are you actually sending out using OT traffic? When you're demoing, right? We've seen people move, right? PLCs for or move cards from slot to slot, or be like, hey, how are you actually generating this out? Peeking under the hood will help. Another one that I kind of like is make sure, like, if they're claiming to do network-based asset ID, and they don't have reverse engineers and they don't have protocol devs, then it's probably a good tell that they're not playing in the kind of proprietary vendor asset ID space. Because you generally either have to convince an OEM to give you their proprietary protocol through a partnership, of which they have to trust the company or the vendor enough to do that, or you're kind of, figuring out the bits or bytes level. And I'll tell you, we do have the reverse engineers. We do develop, our own protocol parsers, for given protocols. And I'll tell you, even from some of the protocols we've see out there, there's some good blogs where people have already them. For some of the proprietary protocols, they all disagree. And then you go into GitHub into some of the popular, proprietary repos, and it's like, okay, they got like 60 to 80% on this protocol before they hit kind of a hard challenge. And so, for Asset ID, again, location matters, who the vendor's partnership matters. And then, you know, if you're spending a lot of money on Asset ID, like you should be asking some under the hood type questions on what's this generating. To kind of call out a good opportunity to see this is S4 X25 is coming up here in about a month. They have the vulnerability village. Some of the players in the vulnerability village, right, are ones that, are playing in this space. So understanding how some of them do Asset ID is kind of key to getting that, like, okay, how mature are you as a vendor at actually dealing with these protocols? Because again, it's not easy. To share a last example, John and I worked through, we have a PCAP of like 3 Ethernet IP packets and a PCAP. and I think it sends like 60 or 80 different function calls, all valid PLC commands in 3 packets. And so, understanding like, hey, at a sophistication level, is this product looking at all 57 to 60 function code calls in this packet, or is it just kind of choosing the first function code it gets to? And understanding how people manage that's key. So there's a lot of technical depth there. It comes down to understanding the engineering of your environment and like how sophisticated the vendor actually is you're looking at.
Thanks for that. So one last question. I know we're coming up to time here. So we talked a bit about, remote assets or hard to reach assets. And so I'd love to get a little bit more insight from you guys on, what are the best ways to do that? If, for instance, if you're an electric utility and you have far-reaching substations that you can't necessarily get out to do a physical audit, what are the ways to go about that so that you can ensure that your asset ID is accurate and correct?
I mean, so as you define out your asset ID strategy, like ideally you have overlap between solutions. So you don't just get an asset ID solution and stop doing walkdowns or stop doing assessments. There's KPIs you can set up around like, okay, hey, this asset ID solution, got me this level, but then we did this kind of assessment and we're completely surprised with it, right? So to that point, like having a sound strategy and understanding your layering on it, is going to be key for building, that program, right? Because no tool is perfect. Again, like they all have strengths and weaknesses, even across that quad of 4. And so, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you guys for answering that and thank you for the time today. This was a really great session. We do this monthly with a different topic each month, so you can register for those. We put them out on our LinkedIn as well as our monthly or weekly newsletter, rather, where we'll announce all of the topics and we share blog posts and things that are relevant to OT cybersecurity. So feel free to follow us along on our social media or reach out to our team here if you're inspired to get your asset ID under control this year. So again, thank you everyone for joining and we will see you all next time.